Fossil graveyards are something that most people probably aren't familiar with. It's the idea that you have a mass mortality. That means a large number of animals were destroyed and buried pretty much at the same time. And probably the most popular of these types of deposits are the dinosaurs. But there are areas of concentration, which have always made me wonder. Let's look at what the sediments were doing. Maybe this is a low area and these things were being washed in and deposited in kind of little low areas and concentrated in that way by waters that were moving these bodies. We find things like this all over the globe.
For example, there are layers in central Utah where there are brachiopods. Brachiopods are like clams. There are, I don't know, billions of these organisms that make up these layers. That's a fossil graveyard. It's unconscionably high count of fossils. I'm working on a bone bed in Wyoming right now where we have the remains of 10,000 or more dinosaurs. It certainly speaks of catastrophe. You don't get bone beds formed without catastrophes. We found out in our deposit, at least, the bones are not as we would expect them to be if a bunch of animals had died over a period of time. Instead, the bones are all disarticulated and they're sorted according to the size. So we have big bones at the bottom and little bones on top. And the only way you could get that to happen is if you transported the whole mass of bones as a debris flow very rapidly into deeper water, and the bones sorted themselves as they traveled.
To take the Karoo Basin, I mean, it's massive. And the dinosaurs and the creatures are orientated in the direction of stream flow. And the modern thinking would be, well, it would have had to be in river basins where these creatures were deposited, stretching over virtually the entire continent. That's some river. It doesn't happen today. You have to imagine such a totally different world in the past. There are so many things which point to a universal flood.
The violent forces of the flood washed thousands of animals into large areas where they later became fossilized. However, under different conditions, the same plant and animal debris turned into coal.
Coal is masses of plant material that have been deposited in a unit, and they've been sort of compacted and changed chemically into coal. Coal deposits can be very extensive. They can be very thick, up to 1,000 feet thick for individual bed.
We find it in these very flat seams that have usually very sharp tops and bottoms to them and so on, which is not the way plants normally grow. This looks transported, obviously water deposited.
You find marine organisms in coal fields, which are terrestrial deposits. This belies any story that would contradict the biblical scenario.
We find massive amounts of coal. We have, over in Wyoming, we have millions and millions of tons of coal. In Australia, we have millions and millions of tons of coal. In Europe, we have back in Pennsylvania and all these sorts of things.
And they cover thousands of square miles. And you find the same kind of coal deposits, the same place in the geologic record, widespread in Europe, going over into Russia, and we could go on.
The widespread distribution of these coal beds is global in nature, and irregardless of their location, these coal beds also appear in the same place in the geological column, which shows they were deposited at the same time. Therefore, logic necessitates the conclusion that the formation of these coal beds is the result of a water-based catastrophe that occurred globally about the same time. It's estimated that 2 to 3 feet of vegetation is required to form 1 foot of coal. Some coal beds are more than 100 feet thick, which would require more than 200 to 300 feet of vegetation while covering an area of tens of thousands of square miles. When scientists look at the amount of coal we have on Earth today, they realize there's no way all the vegetation on the planet could produce that amount of coal, and I agree. The difference is they believe the coal formed is millions of years worth of accumulated vegetation. But the Bible tells us that the earth before the flood was a lush green planet.
It's not implausible to have this come from just the vegetation that existed just before the flood.
Many scientists, for example, believe that the firmament in its construction allowed the earth to be under a little over 2 atmospheres of pressure. And these 2 atmospheres of pressure would engender significant growth.
Where we now see vast deserts, mountain ranges, and frozen continents, there was once before the flood fertile land and vast forests unlike anything now seen. We find large amounts of oil in the deserts of the Middle East, a remnant of its former green landscape. And from drill cores in Antarctica, scientists have found the continent once was a tropical forest covered with palm trees. The vast forests buried in the earth at the time of the flood, which have now since changed to coal and oil, formed the extensive deposits that we see today. These evidences are among many that testify of God's love for man in the creation of a beautiful, lush, green planet, one that was destroyed by a global water-based catastrophe as recorded in the Bible.
The flood is the event that harmonizes what we see in geology in terms of a recent creation by God, which was in just 6 days, a few thousand years ago, as described in the Bible.
There's so much evidence we cannot possibly investigate it in such a short time, but if we step back and look at the big picture, the earth itself is its own witness. We saw how the flat, horizontal, sedimentary layers in the Grand Canyon with no erosion between them testify to the fact that these layers were laid down rapidly and not over millions of years. We saw the size of this catastrophe had to be at least as large as some of the layers they formed, which are larger than some continents, affirming its global impact. We saw how hundreds of millions or even billions of years of expected deposition or erosion is completely missing between these sedimentary layers, showing that what we see does not conform to the evolutionary model. We saw in the first sedimentary layer containing animal fossils that they were found fully formed, not in incremental evolutionary steps. We see how the existence of fossils in these layers is evidence of rapid burial, as some fish fossils are found with food in their mouths or in positions of swim. We saw how massive fossil graveyards are strong evidence that thousands of dead animals, fish, mammals, and even birds were all washed together and deposited in lowlands where they were buried and fossilized. We saw how the massive coal and oil deposits found today could only be formed by compressed vegetation from a lush green earth that was destroyed and buried. We saw how the Cretaceous chalk layer formed by the flood covers every continent as one would expect from a global catastrophe. When we sit back and look at our planet, what do we see? The Earth itself tells us it was once decimated by a global water-based catastrophe. So why is it, with a world full of evidence, that the story of the flood as found in the Bible is rejected by some of the brightest minds in the scientific community in general? I'll give you a clue. It has little to do with the evidence.
The Bible gives us an explanation of a history, that the earth and life were created perfect, and then it has changed because of sin. If that's true, why are so many scientists fully opposed to that point of view? And the reason has more to do with worldview than it does with data. Leaving religious perspectives out of it doesn't solve that problem. Bias is not a religious problem, it's a human problem.
No matter what we profess, whether we say I'm a Christian and I reject evolutionary biology, or I'm an evolutionist and I reject Christianity, or if I'm someplace in the middle muddling around here, nonetheless, everything that we do, everything that we see, everything we say and understand, our entire worldview, the way we formulate our concepts, our thoughts of what we see and know in the world around us, are inalterably or unavoidably affected by these two views.
And that worldview has a very strong influence on what we notice, on the kind of questions we ask.
If you restrict the number of interpretations that you can put on the data with your worldview, then obviously that's going to restrict the kind of theories that you can come up with. So, for example, if you're looking at the materialistic worldview, and you're looking at these amazing molecular machines that I enjoy studying, or the information that's recorded in DNA. There are any number of theories that you come up with based on that data that you've collected. But if you're a materialist, none of your theories could suggest that an intelligent mind wrote that information in the DNA. That's a theory that's not allowed.
Evolution belies the laws of physics. Everything moves from a higher to a lower grade. There's always a regression. There is never the reverse. That is the law of thermodynamics. And life defies the law of thermodynamics. So here you have a theory which basically violates every single physical law, and yet it is one of the basic theories which is even enshrined in legislation. That's mind-boggling.
Science is defined as a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. The problem evolution has is that it is not a testable explanation. Evolution necessitates that in some way, somehow, something that is not alive could by itself create something that is alive. This mysterious event has not been observed anywhere in nature or in the laboratory, and therefore it does not pass the scientific method, so it cannot be established as scientific fact. All life consists of DNA, which is very complex, organized information. The reason why natural processes cannot and will never produce life is because natural processes do not create or organize information. Organization requires intelligence, and where we see evidence of organization, we see evidence of God. Therefore, the most supreme revelation the study of science and the natural world can ever grant mankind is a discovery of the existence of the supernatural.
In spite of this, the pride of human bias and man's commitment to a godless worldview still influences our courts and educational institutions, which, to this day, mandate by law evolution be taught as an infallible fact.
People have asked me a question about why is it that science seems to be becoming more and more confident in their commitment to a completely evolutionary origin of life. Is that because we've got more data? Well, no, it really isn't. It's because there's becoming increasing confidence, increasing commitment to a worldview. And I think part of that is because of the political battles over what's going to be taught in public schools.
When they say that you have to teach that, then you are basically saying, in my personal opinion, that every teacher has to be a liar. It's pretty obvious. Because he has to proclaim that which is a theory of modern science. When there are better theories to explain what we see, which are excluded If they were to put them both before the students as a matter of comparison and choice, that would be fair. But the way in which it is today belies comprehension.
You don't talk about God in textbooks, science textbooks, scientific articles, and so on. God is out of the picture. But what if God exists? This is no way to find truth.
So that's how a worldview can constrict things. One of the things that I really appreciate about the biblical worldview that Christians embrace is that it's liberating.
We can't say that all reality is only what I can see mechanistically and so on. There's nothing that tells us that that's all to reality. I prefer a broader approach. Well, let's include God and the possibilities here and look at the scientific data. And the scientific data tends to point us towards God. When you say, well, no, I'm not going to get involved with religion or the Bible because that's not science, I think you're being unnecessarily restrictive and you are eliminating the possibility of you investigating that which might be true.
But science has a certain appeal to the independence of the human mind and heart. Science is the realm of the human. This is what we've done. This is what we know. Whereas religion, faith, Christianity, that's the realm of God.
I think the main impediment to accepting the biblical account of origins is the consequences of accepting it.
Now, the problem of bringing God into the discussion is that it brings back in the question of moral accountability.
And to say that there is morality in an evolutionary paradigm is to fool yourself.
You can't have a supreme being and lower beings without defining that relationship somehow. And intuitively, we recognize that that's a moral law. And we may not look very good examined in that light. And so to escape the concept of judgment, to escape the concept of moral accountability, there's a natural tendency to want to forget the Creator. And consequently, things like the story of the flood, the evidences that are still visible on the earth, these are things that maybe subconsciously at times we're pretty happy to find an alternative explanation. We're comfortable moving away from the idea of moral accountability.
Eliminating moral accountability meant rewriting the history of the world, and this is exactly what happened. A new worldview was adopted, in particular a worldview that did not include the history of the flood, thus trying to eliminate God's judgment and therefore any moral accountability. But how could such a dramatically different worldview catch on? Well, the perfect opportunity arose towards the end of the Dark Ages.
If we look at popular culture today, the flood story is not one that is commonly accepted. It's literally true. And so it's easy to look at it and say, nobody believes that. Well, that sort of begs the question a little bit, what about the last few thousand years? And the answer is, everybody believed it. In fact, the universal flood story has been noted time after time in cultures scattered around the world. Every culture, it seems, has a story of a flood, and they all drew some lessons from it. The lessons may vary here and there, but they believed it. So why don't we believe it now?
Students will sometimes ask me, how did science come to the point of view that they have now that denies miracles and are passionately unwilling to believe in creation? And you have to go through a little history to explain that.
Our society has been subjected to a whole fabric of intellectual ideas set to undermine the history of the flood, the history of the world, the history of creation.
The entire surface of the earth had been changed by a water-based catastrophe, and this overwhelming evidence can't be erased or removed, so in the minds of those that rejected the flood story, it needed to be reinterpreted. And this is how it happened.
All during the Middle Ages, some factors in society were very autocratic and dogmatic and persecuting people, making life very hard for people, suppressing them. And what were those agencies that were doing that? Well, it was governments and the church.
One of the greatest things that man wants to have over man is power. In the Middle Ages, the church ruled the world.
So during the Dark Ages, the medieval time period, for 1,500 years, you had this nearly monolithic, universal, well, throughout Europe anyhow, rule of the Catholic Church. One of the arenas of conflict in the developing new freedom of thought with the existing structures of the Catholic Church over the last 1,500 years was, of course, the area of science. And the stories are fairly well known of all these scientists, from Galileo to Newton to Copernicus to Francis Bacon, who came into conflict with the church. Probably Galileo is the one that is most famous. He promoted the heliocentric, or the sun at the center and all the little planets going around. But the church didn't like that for a variety of philosophical reasons. To have the earth at the center was important philosophically. That was a mark of the perfection of God's creation, and to have the idea kicked around that the earth wasn't what we thought it was, and that these other planets weren't going in perfect circles, that wasn't popular. So Galileo was called up by the Inquisition, placed under house arrest, threatened with serious punishment, possibly death. We use that story now, unfortunately, many times to create an unworkable antagonism between Christianity and science. And that's not what ought to be learned from that lesson. Because when we look at the teachings of the church through the Dark Ages, in many cases, it's not what the Bible says.
The world had been subjected to a very rigid religious thinking. And anything that was slightly out of that tight box was regarded as contra truth, contra God, contra Bible, and had to be eradicated by force and by inquisition and by death penalty.
And you came finally to a point in history where the people were tired of that. They were weary of it. The church was losing its credibility because of that, because of the way they had treated people. The governments, the people were tired of the way governments had treated them. And this led to a movement among scholars to move away from authority, from any of these autocratic agencies.
And the view of God was one of this wrathful deity who was lurking in the woods, just waiting for the transgressor to put a foot wrong.
And the kings ruled not of love but out of greed, controlled not out of love but out of fear, including the church.
In seeing the abuse of power that had prevailed over Europe, they utterly rejected the Catholic Church, which of course in their mind meant that they utterly rejected Christianity. And so that gave rise to a more atheistic-minded society.
And the mindset of man says, well, what was the restricting force? The restricting force to any mind expansion was God. And therefore, let's get rid of him. Let's get rid of God so that we can grow intellectually. And that's what they did in the French Revolution.
Instead of holding the masses in blind submission to her dogmas, Rome's work resulted in making them infidels and revolutionists. They regarded her greed and cruelty as the fruit of the Bible, and they would have none of it. Rome had misrepresented the character of God, and now men rejected both the Bible and its author. This led to the French Revolution and ultimately the complete removal of the church's power it had maintained over the people for more than 1,000 years. In the French National Assembly, the mob of revolutionaries declared only reason should be worshipped. They revealed a beautiful woman adorned in blue drapery and proclaimed her the goddess of reason.
And they enshrined the goddess of reason. And reason took the place of faith in God.
They carried this woman on a car to Notre Dame, destroyed the church, and preached atheism to the masses inside the church every week.
The French people responded to the many centuries of Roman Catholic oppression and persecution by establishing a new form of government. Instead of a nation with a Christian worldview, howbeit perverted and ruled by the Catholic Church at the time, a society was formed with an atheistic worldview, absent of any Christian influence. And this was called the Age of Enlightenment.
They didn't want to have anything else to do with God. They saw that God was tyrannical. People were forced to believe. And so now, let's remove God from the equation altogether.
And that's what happened in the French Revolution. We moved from a God-centered environment to a reason-based environment.
Atheism arose, tremendously in France. Look what happened in France. The Bible was burned, was destroyed. And that's called the Age of Enlightenment.
And so we see this idea of enlightenment totally removing God from the picture.
Out of all the segments of French society, it was the Catholic priests who suffered the highest per capita mortality rate. There was a lot of animosity, and they took it out on the church. And in most cases, that means they took it out on Christianity.
In an effort to defend science and reason as the new ideals for society, the atheistic endeavor went about to de-Christianize France in what became known as the Reign of Terror. Priests were imprisoned or executed. Churches and religious monuments were vandalized or destroyed. The word saint was removed from street signs. The worship of a deity was forbidden. Bibles were burned publicly, and the rallying cry of the French infidels was, "Crush the wretch," referring to Christ in the form of his church. Christians became the objects of public hatred. Many were shot dead while on their knees in prayer, and their bodies left where they fell at their places of worship. In the forests where Christians gathered, bodies hung from trees and scattered the ground everywhere. All this was the result of the atheistic movement called the Great Enlightenment. And those who thought to dethrone the Catholic Church for centuries of torture and bloodshed were now themselves guilty of the same crimes.
The culminating events coming out of the Enlightenment and then up to the French Revolution, which seemed to indicate the death of Christianity.
All this was as Satan would have it. His policy is deception, and his purpose is to bring wretchedness upon men, to deface the workmanship of God, to mar the divine purpose of love, and to thus cause grief in heaven. Then, by his deceptive arts, he leads men to throw the blame on God, as if all this misery were the result of the Creator's plan. When the people found Romanism to be a deception, he urged them to regard all religion as a cheat, and the Bible as a fable.
The papacy looked like it was going to die. Society was freed to consider a different alternative. Let's put it that way.
This Age of Enlightenment, this free thinking, actually was the beginning of what I would call modern science.
This movement away from authority, really, we think of it in terms of the period of time called the Enlightenment.
You don't have this bridle on you, and you can begin to explore, and you can begin to look, and you can begin to use human reason.
People were, in fact, moving away from their confidence in governments and in the church and wanting to think for themselves and bring out more human freedom. And this freedom went many different directions, including moving away from belief in God.
If it hadn't been for the French Revolution and the mindset that God is not involved in the process, reason takes the place of God, then there wouldn't have been a fertile soil for the development of evolutionary thinking.
The new generation, if you wish, of earth science individuals, most notably Lyell and Darwin, came to the fore in the 1800s.
Charles Lyell was a geologist who for the first time introduced the concept of long periods of time in the development of geological features, and then he wrote this work, The Principles of Geology.
These geological views Lyell espoused in his book became known as uniformitarianism.
Uniformitarianism is the belief that things as they unfold and happen today were no different from what they were in the past. So if something takes a very long time to develop today, it must have taken a very long time in the past.
Uniformitarianism is the basis for believing in the millions of years of time so critical to the theory of evolution. The widespread acceptance of the principle behind uniformitarianism was foretold in the Bible to be one of the prevailing reasons why people at the end of time would deny both creation and the global flood.
There shall come a time in the last days, scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, "Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation."
This is what uniformitarianism teaches, that all things have continued at the same rate since the beginning.
But what if there's a catastrophe? What if you have a major storm and all of the material that uniformitarianism said would eventually disappear just like that? And that's what we see.
The view that things have remained the same since the beginning of creation is a philosophy God warned would characterize a belief system in the last days. And this mindset, we're told, would lead people to be willingly ignorant of the fact that the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. The prophecy says they will be willingly ignorant, meaning they'll be unwilling to consider any evidence for the flood. And this is exactly how Charles Lyell described his own views. Lyell wrote regarding fossils, saying, "We cannot account for their present position by the universal deluge. I hold in utter abomination most learned academicians, those systems which are built with their foundations in the air and cannot be propped up without a miracle." As a naturalist, Charles Lyell rejected all miracles as an explanation, but it was not his observations in science that led him to this conclusion. It was his commitment to his own worldview. He revealed his bias against the biblical flood story when, in a letter he wrote, "These views of geological ages will free science from Moses." These ideas then were passed from Charles Lyell to the young 22-year-old seminary student, Charles Darwin.
When Charles Darwin was commissioned to travel on the Beagle, one of the books he took with him was Charles Lyell's book on principles of geology. And here he was reading this information, and he comes to the Galapagos Islands and he sees these finches, and the finches are of such a broad variety. So the idea comes that obviously these finches must have evolved from a pair that happened to get to the islands, and all the varieties evolved thereafter. And then these geological ideas fit in, but this must have taken time. And Lyell's ideas start kicking in. He therefore says, if this variety that I see here developed over time and change took place by natural selection, then God did not create.
Charles took the ideas about long ages of time that Lyell applied to geology and then applied them to biology. Then he had given biological evolution something it didn't previously have, a scientific mechanism by which to operate.
Darwin came up with the new theory, the natural selection, and that was kind of the magic bullet of the day. That's what gave plausibility that now we've found a mechanism that can account for this change over long periods of time.
Darwin later became close friends with Lyell, and it's been said by some that he was the most influential person in Darwin's life. Darwin commented on Lyell's view about the flood and said, Lyell is most firmly convinced that he has shaken the faith in the deluge far more efficiently by never having said a word against the Bible than if he had acted otherwise.
In the middle of the 19th century, things started changing. Towards the end of that century, the scientific community started excluding God from its interpretations. Now, God has been expelled from the exponential menu of the scientific community.
The theory of evolution has become the foundation of our global society today, and the catastrophic results of such a belief can be seen everywhere, in the denial of moral accountability, in the denial of God, and therefore the denial of the flood. But perhaps more than any other belief, evolution has pushed our society closer to the magnitude of the wickedness that existed in the days of Noah.
And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually.
Wickedness and evil is how God defined the thoughts of man before the flood. This is all the more applicable to us when we consider what the Bible has to say about the thoughts of the wicked.
The wicked, through the pride of his countenance, will not seek after God. God is not in all his thoughts.
And the Bible says that God is not in all his thoughts. What is really being said is God is not in any of his thoughts. The wickedness that was great in the earth in the days of Noah was a godless society that did not seek after him nor think of him. With this in mind, we can see a direct fulfillment in Jesus' prophecy that as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it also be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man.
Taking it home for the touchdown.
We are getting to the point in this world today where God is being so marginalized, even in political systems and laws that are being made, that for all intents and purposes, he's being written out of human existence and human psyche. So we're at the same point today.
Some of the things that were happening before the flood, in particular, the Bible tells us that the land was full of violence. And people evidently were not only guilty of committing violence, it sounds like they were entertained by violence, which is something that's going on in the world today. And a lot of sophisticated and kind people would just be shocked at the idea they would be guilty of murder, but they don't think twice about being entertained by watching other people commit murder. Same thing with the law of adultery. People who say, I would never commit adultery, but they're entertained by watching. And the Bible talks about it's not just those that do them, but those that have pleasure in those that do them.
The do whatever you please mindset is what we have with us today.
The loss of integrity of the Word of God began in the late 1700s and into the 1800s. The rise of evolution took away the sense of God as our creator, that we have a creator, that we have a personal God, and that there is judgment.
If you believe in evolution, it's absurd to believe in a judgment.
But if we do not believe that God had the flood in the beginning, why am I going to believe that he's going to destroy the world by fire? Doesn't make sense. So if I can get you to deny the flood, then basically I've got a leg up on you in denying the eternal destruction of the world as we know it.
As our global culture moves away from the idea of moral absolutes and our culture shuns the need for a standard of morality, we see suffering, crime, and misery increasing proportionally until life itself is not respected. As things continue to get worse in our world, it becomes all the more apparent why a judgment of justice is necessary and why it was necessary in the days of Noah.
Evil had perpetuated itself to such an extent that there was no solution anymore. It would have continued at that rate forever and ever and ever, which would mean a universe of eternal misery. Who would want to live in a universe like that for all eternity? If you look at parents at their children's graves and the agony and the pain that is associated with that, there must be a judgment. And so God set a limit. And before all mankind should have been engulfed in this, and no witness remain to the love of God and the original intent of creation, to live in peace and harmony and love together with God, then there would have been nothing left to continue the story about the love of God. So God had to intervene.
God is loving, God is patient. But as he told Moses, while he is long-suffering and abounding in forgiveness and mercy, he will by no means clear the guilty, that there is a time of judgment.
And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years.
It tells us that there were 120 years of warning and pleading. Judgment does not come out of the blue, although those who have chosen to ignore all the warnings for 120 years in Noah's case may think it did. Judgment is always has been tempered with mercy, but mercy does not make judgment avoidable. There comes a time when the rain will fall.
And he destroyed this world with a flood. And this destruction stands as a guarantee for another judgment that must come later on. Now the Bible says that the later judgment will be by fire. It will not come by flood again. There might be intermittent floods, but the final judgment will come by fire.
Whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens and the earth, which are now, by the same word are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men.
The world was baptized by water in the days of Noah. 2 Peter 3 says it will be baptized by fire when the Lord returns. And then he's going to make a new heaven and a new earth. So the earth is born again, you might say, after it goes through this water baptism from Noah's time, but he protected Noah and his family. It's going to be baptized with fire at the second coming, but he will once again protect his people.
So the same message that we have here in the Genesis account must be preached at the end of time as well.
At the end of time, the days of Noah will be repeated, and the rocks and the fossils of the earth bear witness to this fact. Like the story of Genesis, the earth itself is both a record and a prophecy, warning us of another judgment still to come. But when? At the end of time, there are three warnings given to man that immediately precede the second coming of Christ. These warnings are given by three angels and have become known as the three angels' messages. In the days of Noah, when the message of judgment was being given, was the world's first judgment hour. And now, at the end of time, the first angel's message echoes Noah's warning by announcing the hour of his judgment is come. In part 2 of the Days of Noah, we will investigate these messages and even discover the very year when this judgment hour announcement is made and when the days of Noah for the last generation will begin.
The story of the ark basically parallels the three angels' messages.
The three angels' messages of Revelation 14 are God's last message to the world.
It is an end-time message, and it is a message that actually prepares the world for the coming of Christ.
Noah followed God's instructions in the preparation of the ark, and we will see how the three angels' messages point us back to an ancient structure of God's design that reveals the instructions God's people are to follow in preparation for His second coming at the end of time.
The first angel's message points us to truth. The second angel's message points us to the counterfeit. And the third angel's message says choose. And Noah called the people to a choice. Choose. Make your decision, but know that these decisions are final.
An hour of judgment is coming. People are being warned in advance because God loves man and wants to save them.
And God will once again see the wickedness of man and say that the thoughts of his heart and mind are only evil continually. And He will once again bring judgment.
So it's a message of warning, it's a message of love, but it's a message also that there's impending judgment.
Contact with biblical truth, I came into contact with a choice. I was an atheist, and prophecy told me there was a God. So I've had to make choices, and choices cost you. When I made the choice no longer to believe in evolution, but to preach creation, it had consequences because I was a zoologist. And I was in a secular university in a zoology department. So the consequence was that I resigned, no longer willing to compromise that which I now believe for the sake of financial gain.
There's some both encouraging and sobering things in the flood story for me. One is that you can't wait until a message is popular. If it's the truth, you need to embrace it no matter what everyone else in the world does. Someone once said that a dumb idea is still a dumb idea even if 1 million people believe it. And even though Noah was in the minority, it's clear today he was right. And God is looking for people who will stand up even though the truth is not popular.
My Christian faith is not dependent on my science, yet one can't help wondering if the two shouldn't coincide. If God is the author of both, then why shouldn't the natural world coincide with the biblical account? I'm looking to see if we can't do good science and make breakthroughs in our understanding of the world around us by using the Bible as a starting point. So it has encouraged me. It has certainly developed confidence in God's Word, and for that I'm grateful.